Some of the basic terminologies of testing might be very tricky to understand sometimes, and it is really important and crucial for us to have a good differentiation between them. Say, for example, if you talk about some of the simple terms like mistake, error, bug, defect, fault, and failure. And what if I ask you to just answer one question here, that are they all same or different? Probably most of you would say that they are all different, but the challenge what we may face is to differentiate uniquely between these words. So let's talk more about these terms today and identify them uniquely to create a difference between them. Let's get started. Hey friends, and greetings for the day. Welcome to another episode of Testing in Nutshell. This is Neeraj Kumar Singh, and we are today talking about some of the basic terminologies of testing, which I just gave you quite a moment ago. That is, what about some simple terms like mistake, error, bug, defect, fault, and failure. To begin with, the very first word is mistake. A mistake is generally defined as a human being when he or she does anything wrong unintentionally is what you call it as a mistake. And mistake basically turns to be an error. But when you talk about its international standards like IEEE, ISTQB, and so on, they have a general definition to these terms saying that errors and mistakes are synonyms. That means they mean the same. That is, when anything goes wrong or anything is done wrong unintentionally in a development or environment, we call it as an error. The next question which comes to the mind is why generally errors takes place, or why a human makes anything wrong. Of course, there are a lot of factors which influence the errors to happen in the real practices. So of course, some of the factors are when you talk about the time pressure, which is a very common factor when you generally make mistakes, or you talk about the complexity of the product, no proper communication between the stakeholders, poor documentation, or sometimes the necessary resources being unavailable at the time when it is required to review them and understand them before you can actually get going with implementing the practices. The next important terminology here to understand is defect. Generally, defect is what the term we use in testing when it comes to determining any kind of issues which a tester finds while executing a particular test case. But there are also two terms which are in relation to that. We call it as bug or fault. We have been commonly using the term bug for a lot of terminologies with relation to anything which goes wrong in the industry. But if you look at the IEEE standards or ISTQB standards, they call it as synonyms of defect. So defect, bug, and fault, they all are same as per ISTQB. So what are they basically in the real-time industry? Then let me give you a clear picture of that. Most of the organization, they call bug as an internal identified issue. Now generally, when a tester tries to execute a test, and if that test fails, then we say that we found a bug. But the same issue, if found by the customer or the client, or say probably the end user who is external to your organization, and he reports that during the development phase, you say that it is a defect. And it's a very common practice which I have experienced by visiting a lot of organizations, that what we find, we call it as a bug, and what other people find outside the organization, we call it as a defect, generally the customer. But as per ISTQB and IEEE standard, defect is just the word which we are supposed to use, which simply means that it is the deviation between the expected and actual result of a particular behavior or functionality. Otherwise, they all are synonym of bug and defect. And to be frank, the bug is also called as informal name of defect, but not a formal way of calling it. The common reasons for defects to take place is basically the errors which are made earlier. So once an error is made, and if error goes unidentified, it results into a defect in the environment or the application together. The third terminology is with respect to the entire approach, and we call it as a failure. Failure is generally defined as when you try to do a particular activity or a kind of transaction on the application, and the application fails to behave the way it is supposed to do. For example, you fill in all the necessary information on a particular page and click on submit, and the page crashes, or probably does not take you to the next relevant page, and you call it as a failure. So same way in testing, the term failure is used to define that when something is not happening from the point of core functionality of an application is what we call it as a failure. Or in simple terms, we can also say it as when a product does not perform what it is supposed to do is what you call it as a failure. Now that generally happens again as a part of the approach of the test execution. So I can also add to this in different terminology or definition that a failure is something which is visible to tester while executing test cases. So as a part of test execution, tester generally performs the test cases on the product and basically experiences a failure and reports that failed scenario to the development organization for the resolution. To be frank, if you sometimes think deeper, it is quite impossible for a tester to determine what is the defect, because they don't really know what the defect is. They only know is what failed on the screen. Now let's get a little deeper on this. Say for example, when you report a defect, what is that do you provide as information? The defect summary, the defect severity, defect impact of course, and the priority, the environment used, reproducibility clause, and any other necessary information like expected, actual, the test case, test data, and all those information. But where's the defect? What is the defect? That was not at all mentioned. We do call it as a defect being reported because this actually failed. But of course, you need to find out the root cause to determine that what was the defect all about. So then sometime we come up and say that the failures may have happened because of the code or environment or maybe the wrong data. So actually that was not a defect because environment factor is a part of environment, but that was not a part of the application functionality. Probably when you talk about the wrong data, what if I was doing a mistake there and I was picking up wrong set of data to test that particular functionality and I declared it as a defect. So generally a tester never determines a defect. They only report a failed scenario, and that is what we call it as a tester is one who is always having an approach of conducting failures on the product and reporting that failed scenario to the development team to identify the issue and resolve them. So I hope all of us had a good clarity and understanding about these three terms, that is error, defect and failure, where error is a synonym of mistake or they both are called the same. That is when human does anything wrong unintentionally, we call it as error or mistake. The second term here is defect, which means simply the deviation between the expected and actual result, or when a system behaves other than the one it is supposed to. And when you talk about, so defect is also called as bug or fault informally, whereas the third term we understood today is the failure. Failure is an approach of conducting or identifying if the system is performing the way it is supposed to perform the core functionalities. Or we say that a product is called as a failure when the product cannot do the basic intended functions. So I hope the video was quite interesting for you to realize that these terms are different and how exactly we can relate them together and have a unique definition to each one of them. So that's all from this particular tutorial team. We'll be getting back to you with another tutorial, of course, with a deep dive of a lot of term and technology about testing in upcoming tutorials. Should you have anything else beyond this, do let me know by commenting below. I'll be always there to support you by responding to them. So till then, keep learning, keep exploring and keep understanding the context. Thanks for watching the video team and happy learning.